formal introductions, but before I do, just a couple logistical things. We are streaming live today on Facebook, YouTube, and LinkedIn. So thank you for joining on whichever platform you're watching from today. We're also streaming to Crowdcast for those of you that are watching on Crowdcast. So any of those 4 platforms that you're watching from, we encourage you to please chime in, join the conversation, ask questions at any point along the way. Just hit the chat box with whatever questions or comments you have, and we'll take live audience questions. I'm going to go through the list of questions I have, but I always enjoy when people take us in a different direction and I don't have to get through all my questions. We can cover some additional things that the audience wants to cover as well. So I am excited for our guests here today. Before I introduce them, if you don't mind, maybe just those of you watching live, if you don't mind, just drop in the comments box where you're joining from today. We typically have a pretty global audience, people from all over the world watching. So I'd love to hear and see where all of you are joining from today. So if you don't mind, just drop in the comments box where you're joining from today. I'm going to watch the 3 live streams we have going. I have multiple devices going here, so I'm going to keep an eye on those live streams for any questions you might have. So thanks for being here. And that brings us to our guest here. So, and before I introduce the guest, let me just set the context for what we want to cover today. The topic for today is less ERP software and more digital transformation. And the whole idea here that we want to really unpack and dive into is what are some of the limitations of ERP systems, even though they're important to a lot of organizations, if not most organizations. They're a good backbone, a good foundation for growth and scale, but they're not a complete answer to a lot of organizational and operational challenges that organizations face. So what we want to talk about today is really start to dive into some specific examples of how different types of technology outside the ERP space can complement and augment ERP and really drive organizations to more of a true digital transformation rather than a simple or a more simple ERP implementation. So that's really the topic we want to cover today. And we're going to, with our guest today, we're going to talk quite a bit about consumer product goods companies or CPG companies. But actually, the topics we're going to talk about are very relevant outside that space as well. So some of the use cases we have are for CPG and retail types of organizations. But even if you're not in that space, a lot of what we're talking about is just this whole concept of how to augment ERP with true digital transformation. And that's a topic that is relevant to any industry. So with all of that being said, I want to introduce Meagan, Bowman, and James Sampson from a company called Stonehenge Labs / Stopwatch. So Stopwatch is the product, Stonehenge Labs is the company. So I guess to start, what is it that you both do, and what does the company do in general? Why don't we start there? And Meagan, we'll start with you because I think we just lost James on the feed.
Yeah. Thanks for having us, Eric. When James pops in, he's actually the more interesting of the two of us, believe it or not. Yeah, my name is Meagan Bowman. I'm the founder and CEO of Stopwatch and Stonehenge Technology Labs at a broader level. Oh, there's James.
He's back.
Hey, James. You good? Hello.
Oh, he's muted.
Oh, you're muted. Anyway, and essentially, I kind of come from a background of a combination of retail, consumer packaged goods, data science, and startup. And so that's really kind of my role here at Stonehenge Technology Labs is to, frankly, keep money in the bank, recruit the best talent, get out of the way, and make sure that we've got a company vision. So I'm definitely up a little bit out of the weeds. James actually runs all of our products, so I'll let him talk to the product.
Yeah, so I'm James Sampson, the director of product here at Stopwatch. So kind of from a background perspective, studied supply chain throughout school. Then I've worked really in the ground levels of retail, as well as kind of really in the logistics space. And now kind of being here at Stopwatch, really into kind of the data and analytics and really just making it all work together space is what I would call it. So really, definitely really excited to be here and have everybody, and excited to really dive into everyone's questions and figure out what we have. So
yeah, absolutely. Well, thanks
for having us.
Thanks for being here. Appreciate you both being here. So I guess just to start, I want to dive into some more general questions here in a second about some of the limitations of ERP systems and some examples of what those limitations are and how different types of technology can fill some of those voids. But before I get to those general questions, why don't we start with the product Stopwatch? And that's the product that you guys are working on, and that's the product that your company develops and implements and supports. What inspired you and the team to develop this product? And maybe just to give us a high level overview of what it does and why, what is the problem statement of what you were trying to accomplish with that product?
Yeah, no, Eric. So, you guys study a lot of ERP implementations, which is a huge deal for any large company, right? Like, it doesn't matter. It's just it's ripe with opportunity for great communication, great opportunities for failures, etc. Stopwatch actually is designed to essentially wrap around whatever ERP system has been implemented. So whether it's SAP, Oracle, Microsoft Dynamics, anything like that. And we're specifically focused today on the consumer packaged goods industry. Why the consumer packaged goods industry? Well, because at Stonehenge Labs, our goal is to solve exceedingly complex problems with speed and simplicity. And the consumer packaged goods company is a total mess. I'm sure a lot of industries you work with are pretty messy. The interesting thing about things like chips, trash bags, and toothpaste is you've got this thing called the UPC, right? The Universal Packaging Code. And the proliferation of that throughout all the different retailers and different selling channels is unique, really, to how Stopwatch was built. And so, while Stonehenge Technology Labs, the software can actually, go into manufacturing and education, et cetera, we started with Stopwatch, started with consumer packaged goods companies simply because it was the messiest and most granular that we could find. Of course, if anybody has anything more messy or granular, please feel free to let us know and we'll feel a little bit better about ourselves. But essentially what Stopwatch does is pulls information not only from the ERP system, but also from public and private data sources to service we'll use Coca-Cola, to service Coca-Cola directly and help Coca-Cola understand what's happening in real time through Amazon.com, Walmart.com, Walmart stores, Target, Lowe's, et cetera. And traditionally, these brands have been very channel driven. So the Walmart team understands what their throughput is at Walmart for the Coca-Cola product. Now that we're in a more global situation, and I think ERPs have actually been built more globally, not so much channel driven, but consumer packaged goods over the past 2 years or 20 years, have really kind of mangled that and made them very channel driven. Essentially, Stopwatch kind of gets into that middle tissue layer and says, hey, okay, ERP system, this is enterprise. This is for anything that's, beyond just a specific retailer. And at the same time is sucking in all of the data from the specific retailers so that the decision makers within the consumer packaged goods companies are able to look at both ends of the spectrum, both what currently ought to be and then what currently is in the market. And so we do that through a cloud-based, very simple structure that basically brings together a ton of disparate data, whether it's through retailer portals, public facing data, data that the supplier has that they want to add in on top, specific views out of the ERP, et cetera. And essentially we bring that data together and Stopwatch answers 4 questions. Number 1 is show me what I have. Number 2 is make me smarter, meaning get it organized for me. Number 3 is tell me what to do. So there's a lot of alert activities based on business logic. And number 4 is do it for me. So Stopwatch is actually uniquely designed to interact with the back end of Amazon, the back end of Walmart, et cetera, to actually make impact in real time. So, it's essentially a vision that people who are working in multiple channels can actually cross communicate and be looking at the same data.
Interesting. It's really interesting. So I think you're leading into the first question I have, which is, it sounds like you've created this product to, like you said, you called it an ERP wrapper, I think you said, it, or wraparound or something like that. So it's kind of tying together different pieces of what organizations often have, but don't know how to make use of that data and information and processes. But what in general, when you look at not just your product, but the ERP space in general, the enterprise technology space in general, what are some examples of some of the limitations that these systems have? Because a lot of organizations think of ERP systems as silver bullets. I'm going to put in SAP or Oracle or Microsoft or whatever it is. That's going to automate my entire business. But what you're saying is that's not true. There's gaps. There's other opportunities to drive value even outside what an ERP system does. So maybe help us understand, or give a few examples, if you don't mind, of what some of those limitations are, and maybe even how your product helps fill those gaps.
Yeah, most definitely. So one of the big problems that we do see kind of in the ERP system is just they're not very flexible in regard to being able to adapt to the multiple different variations of products, all of the identifiers and things like that. And if they are, the configuration to get those things really connected and to where it's actionable data is very, very difficult to do. So they're very rigid, and it's much harder to kind of make those type of pivots to get those things really connected out from a flexibility standpoint. The next thing we really run into is just people. It's similar to the flexibility, but versus data storage, it's about process. So ERPs, as they come in, people are very reluctant to actually change their internal processes to then work around how the ERP system wants things to flow, and then it has to have things flow that way. So those are two of the big problems that we really run into, is not being able to have the things that you want to have in the system, and not being able to really work with the things that are in the system in the order and in the process that works best for your organization. So,
yeah, and changing, you mentioned the word flexibility, but changing the software to do those things can be very cumbersome. I think a lot of times people think, well, I'll just configure the software, and if that doesn't work, I'll customize it. But some of the stuff you're talking about that's a total stretch to make ERP systems to do some of the stuff that you're talking about. And obviously each system has its own strengths and weaknesses as well.
Yeah, to kind of build on that, I think, we really respect the ERP because it isn't supposed to be flexible. I mean, it's dealing with your manufacturing and your overseas. I mean, like, that's stuff you want to stay very, very firm at an enterprise level. The challenge is that there's really kind of that gap between, the firmness, meaning the essence of the product or the bill of materials or however things go together, and those weird things that retailers do, like, I don't know, put two together and put them in shrink wrap, or slap a licensing, or a BOGO on them, like, things like that, that are more platform specific or seasonally specific, et cetera. You could spend, hundreds of hours putting in every little, flexible variation that, the retailers are asking to be, put on the shelf. And really, Stopwatch kind of closes that gap and makes sure that every variation has a home to live in within the ERP. But isn't forcing the ERP to make all those gyrations that are typically just too cumbersome or don't happen fast enough.
Yeah. And you think about something as complex as apparel, and I early in my career, I spent some time trying to implement ERP at apparel companies, and it's just really kludgy because you have size, color, different sizes and colors and styles that, it's sort of a matrix of, it's the same product, but that same product has all these different variations based on size, color, and style. So it's, stuff like that. Like, I remember that being a huge problem trying to implement an ERP system that could manage certainly the front end stuff, the customer facing side, but also even just as much so the back end side of manufacturing. It was a stretch to make that stuff work. And a lot of,
I would say, I believe ERPs have gotten more flexible even since then, but at the same time, as they've gotten better, so did, like, COVID happen, and all of a sudden everybody has to sell everything online immediately. So I actually, like, I feel like ERPs have kind of, like, made some good headway, and then we all just got smacked in the face. And luckily, Stopwatch was kind of not betting on COVID, but betting on the idea that companies would have more, flexible needs faster than the ERP systems would be able to, uniquely customize per industry or per company. And so that's kind of where we ended up being a wrapper, which is a great place to be.
Yeah, absolutely. So one thing you alluded to, one of you alluded to already that I want to dive into a little bit more is that, a lot of organizations, not just in the CPG space, but just organizations in general, have spent the last few decades implementing and using different types of enterprise technologies, and they've accumulated all this data over the years. And so that's the good news. The good news is they've been capturing data. They've automated or codified some of the stuff that in decades past they wouldn't have codified or captured. But now a lot of organizations struggle with, well, what do we do with all this data? How do we make use of it? How do we turn that into actionable information or whatever the case may be? What are some examples of the business value that businesses are missing out on by not mining or making better use of that data that many of them are sitting on?
That's a really good question. So one of the things that we really see across a lot of different organizations that we work with is the alignment of decision making between the data. So these organizations have all of these different data, all of this different data from different sources and different teams, but very rarely are they actually able to look at that data side by side and make decisions together as a company. So that's, I would say, first and foremost, probably the area that runs into problems is just not actually, even if not using it kind of together in sync. So if one team is using this set of data, another team is using this set of data, and organizationally, if they use it together, they can make the organization better versus their independent silos. So that is a major thing there. The next thing that we start to run into is really just a volume, like from a volume perspective, we're getting into an era in a world where people can obtain and, as you mentioned, have all of this data to go, but they actually can't process that data and actually look at it at the same time even. So a lot of teams, even when you branch into the more technical things, like outside of Excel and get it into a little bit more powerful BI tools, the amount of data people are still processing and still manipulating there still surpasses the limits of even those. So with that, you really have to be able to work at all levels, from the very base data and actually get that data summarized and to where it is very malleable, to where it's at that business layer. So sometimes like you can either be trying to look at it way too granular or it's just not bubbled up enough. It's like if you're looking at sales data for one particular retailer. Well, if you're looking at it at the entire, if you're looking at Walmart, for instance, well, looking at your sales for Walmart doesn't necessarily help you figure out how to increase your sales for Walmart. It helps, but knowing and understanding the very granular levels of, okay, well, now I have more items shipping from the store at Walmart, so I need to try and get more store inventory. The FC inventory is lowering. So really being able to kind of understand the very deep nuances of what's making that data kind of happen and what's really causing the root of it to happen.
Yeah, and kind of building on that, I love James about the granularity. It's something as simple as a week, right? And Eric, you see this in industries beyond, beyond what we live in, where, somebody's fiscal year is different than, say, their client's fiscal year, right? And so you've got, executives talking about incentives around, how much you ship this year, right? And, 3 days into it, after none of the numbers are matching up, you realize, oh, their year is February, to February, and ours is January to January. I mean, it seems so simple, but having systems that can mechanize that and receive those inputs to bring things back to normalization, just from a time perspective, it's pretty revolutionary. And what it does is it tears down a lot of the kind of angst that a lot of analysts and executives are feeling around the trustworthiness of their data. So if you go into an environment where you're really trying to solve hard problems, like James mentioned, like
it's one thing to say how many sales happen at Walmart. It's another thing to say, how do we grow? It levels the playing field so that the meeting can kick off with, okay, we're all in the same space. Let's all bring our unique, viewpoints from where we sit in the organization, and you don't have to spend, that really tiresome amount of time trying to make sure that you're all on the same page in order to make good decisions. I think that's been the biggest surprise for us in terms of watching teams implement Stopwatch, is kind of that, I don't want to say emotional piece, but it's just, we didn't realize how many people were spending a lot of emotional time and energy thinking through the legitimacy of their sources. So that's been a fun surprise for us.
Yeah. Now, that is interesting. Why do you think it is that organizations have so much trouble in general integrating data? Just across the organization, across different silos, what do you think that root cause is?
I know that when I was in product development, I wasn't incentivized to really care about data beyond, my particular action plan. I don't know if that's common. I mean, I was kind of more junior at that stage of my career, but I know I had no reason or incentive around the organization to do something bigger than what was right in front of me. I don't know if that's just my position, but James, I'm curious because, in Case Stack, you had some of that as well.
Yeah, I'm trying to. So could you hit me with the question again? I want to make sure I'm hitting everything spot on for you.
Yeah, we're talking about the integration of data across an organization. Why is it that, if organizations have data in their ERP systems or whatever legacy systems they might have used over the years, they've accumulated all this data. Why is it that they have so much trouble integrating it, making use of that data? Or what do you think it is based on your guys' experience?
Yeah, so I definitely think the technical aspects are still a big blocker in that. The investments into the actual tech spaces for CPG. You think about tech for CPG. Well, they still have websites, they still have other internal systems that they're trying to build as well, not only focused around kind of harnessing data. So oftentimes, I think these projects kind of get pushed down kind of the priority ladder internally within the CPG companies themselves, because that's not necessarily the focus of the organization. It'll help them do sales, but they also need to operate the organization. So I think that's where a lot of the resources go from a timing perspective. I think another thing that I've really picked up on is just not knowing that it's available as well. So, as we mentioned, these teams that sit kind of in different seats and they have different roles and different responsibilities, they don't really know that their supply chain guy knew that this item was going to be out of stock 3 weeks ago because he got a call from the manufacturer saying it wasn't going to, so if that information isn't actually translated down, then you're not actually going to be able to use that data. And I think just from a roles, responsibility, and security and how the teams are fundamentally built, I think that's the next stage from a limitation, because you think about it, like, I mean, we're accomplishing this, kudos to us. I do feel like we're smart people, but we're not the only smart people on the planet. Like the technology and the resources are available, but it is how it's definitely based around that priority and just that fundamental way of thinking of we need to make this data shared and we need to make sure our data is accessible. So that's just not something that's really hit the forefront, I think, of the seats. And as it is, they're realizing, oh, this is much harder. And now companies, such as Stopwatch, can get them there a lot faster than they can actually take their own organizations there. And from a buy, borrow, build perspective, by the time they could take their organization there, the technology they chose is going to be out of date and there's going to be something new next time. So it's kind of that point of do we continue to invest internally in that particular piece, because it is so ever changing, which I think kind of gets it cut down a little bit.
Yeah. And it's sort of like, we're talking about just fairly fundamental stuff, trying to integrate the data and trying to make use of it. But if you take it even a step further, then you start to get into where you could really use data to be a game changer, like machine learning and AI and stuff like that, predictive analytics. Is that part of what Stopwatch does? Is it takes that data and uses either machine learning or AI or whatever you want to call it to I know I'm not being very technically specific there on my loose interchange of words there, but how would you describe the way the technology uses some of those data sources that it's pulling from?
Yeah, I'll go ahead and start, and then James can probably, loop back with a more technical aspect. I would say, data science, the 90% of data science is cleaning and normalizing data, period. Like the best machine learning models, and take that a step further to autonomous action, like you can trace them back to how rigid and obsessed the original people putting the information into the model were. I mean, it's and so I want to be really careful on things like machine learning. We talk a lot on our team, and we're just not very sexy. Machine learning is really just doing something that works over and over and over again, faster, et cetera. And every input, from a supervised learning perspective, informs that next action. And so, when people ask us like, hey, do you guys do machine learning? We're always kind of like, yeah, we actually do. But you don't earn the right to get there until like we've cleaned your data so, sparkly that you may not even need that machine learning thing that you thought you needed, because literally like all of the information just kind of raises to the surface when you get to a straight normalization. So most of our engagements, people, they're asking us, for the hot machine learning and stuff. And we're just kind of sometimes the bearer of bad news and say, listen, we'll turn on supervised learning about 3 months in. But we don't, and we definitely won't turn on unsupervised learning until we've got a handle on what the things that are going into the model are actually true. Otherwise, we'll just proliferate the same kind of silliness that you've been living in. And so those are always awkward conversations, and they're not cool. But I think when people understand, when we demystify these technologies, I mean, James can go into the technical pieces of it, but at the end of the day, it's doing more of something that works and less of something that doesn't. Right. And then predict what might work, and then, test and learn. And the cool thing about being it's particularly in the e-commerce, retail unified commerce space is that, you have real-time feedback. You have, did it sell? Did the unit move? And so the models can learn very quickly. But if the models aren't learning in a normalized fashion, if we're training Walmart, if we're training Coca-Cola on Walmart separate from the way we're training Coca-Cola on Amazon, you don't receive that magic gray matter between the two, where Coca-Cola just wants to sell more to consumers. It doesn't really matter to them if it's more through Walmart or Amazon. Okay, so that's a very different input and a very different way to look at your business than, Walmart, so it's one of those where, I always argue, and James and the team deliver this really well. 90% of our work is just getting the data clean, transparent, and right, including all the tribal nuances that only the owner of the data knows, which we oftentimes miss. And if we don't have those tweaked out before we put it into a model, the model's just going to reinforce what we already knew, and we'll be in the same place.
Yeah. There's so much to it, to that whole data piece, as far as just the potential for human interaction to undermine the quality of the data, or to make the data less meaningful. And then certainly on the output side, if you don't have the right human interaction, the right tools to make use of that data, that could be very challenging. We actually have, just as a side note, we have some questions starting to come in on social media. First of all, just to get back to the point or the question of where people are, it appears that your stomping ground there of Bentonville, Arkansas, is sort of a hotbed of not only CPG type stuff, but some of the audience, several audience members are from the Bentonville area. We have someone from South Bend, Indiana, Charlotte, North Carolina, among other places. So thanks everyone for letting us know where you're joining from today. But the question I want to get to here on LinkedIn is it might be more of a comment, but I'd just be curious to see what you all think here. And this is from Karthik on LinkedIn. And his comment is, it could be the lack of IT strategy. And I think this might have been a response to my question about data and that whole line of questioning I just gave you. But Karthik says it could be the lack of IT strategy, especially when an enterprise uses many products from many different vendors. Vendor products don't really communicate. It's crucial. An enterprise needs to have a centralized system that will orchestrate the core of the business. For example, in a hotel business, they have to orchestrate the hotel room reservation. So what are your thoughts on that? As far as, would you agree with that a lot of it is the different products that don't integrate or don't communicate well together? And is that something that Stopwatch helps solve?
Yeah, no, I definitely think that's a good call out from that perspective. Like it's that is definitely something we see across our members, to where this team is using this tool, this team is using this tool, and then they have to pay by license, so they keep it restricted, and then those tools don't talk to each other, and there is never a way to kind of extract out those values together. So definitely 100%. From that strategy perspective of, like, as they grow and as they have these different tools that kind of solve little bits and pieces of the information, or kind of bits and pieces of their problem, they're never kind of putting it into this, okay, here's all the problems we've solved with all of the tool sets. So now the next person that buys the next tool, it even goes into, we've seen the same organization buy multiple tools to solve the same set of problems across different teams in the organization. It's not only just like, I can't solve it. So it's definitely like just communication is a big thing, and just having that shared budget, having that shared, I think, sense of, I don't want to say sense of purpose necessarily, but from an organization standpoint, having that shared camaraderie of, this is for the company, and this is how we truly push the company forward by working together. That mentality paired with that, it's quick to for the business unit to call out and get another tool in that comes in and solves this particular problem, and then the other team does it, and then it definitely does. And that's to say that is something that we do address as well. So as we come across different teams that are using different tools, different sources, and have different bits of pieces, we've develop things in a way that are very, very customizable. One of the things that we wanted to avoid, and it kind of ties back to the ERP systems, is like, when you buy an ERP system, you're buying a system like that. That is a very expensive, system typically, and they have started making them more and more modularized as we've continued, but it's still not at the level of, you're still going to have stuff in your ERP that no one in your company knows how to use, and no one in your company has any plan to ever use it. Yet you've had to pay for that, and it lives there in your system. You can see it, like you could go play with it if you wanted to. And that's really that's not what we want. So we definitely architected things in a way that can take those various separate systems that may be used, to solve different problems. And if you're already solving that problem and you're happy with the way that problem's being solved, then we don't try to solve that problem again for you. Like that's a waste of your time and hours, from that perspective. But what we do want to do is your solution. We want to make sure that your solution and the answers that you have are available and accessible to everyone else within your organization. And that keeps them from having to buy that, accidentally buying that same thing again. And it just keeps that knowledge kind of in that shared space. So,
Yeah, I second, like, great call out. Carther, is that the name?
That was Karthik.
Carther. I think, at least in the space we're in, so, we can speak specifically to consumer packaged goods, kind of that hierarchy. There's a real tension between IT and the business, like, just being honest. And so I think it is an IT strategy. I also really think, at least, especially in our space, it's a data governance strategy that the leaders of sales, marketing, and brand are also fully bought into. We see this all the time where, we work with everybody from General Mills to Energizer to, big companies, very complex and very smart companies. But their IT oftentimes doesn't know what the business is doing, and vice versa. they have very different budgets, kind of to James's point. And, if you're in a sales and marketing role and you're being incentivized on making more revenue and you see a shiny tool that you can just, buy for $10 a month and make that happen, and you've got this pile of money, you will do that, right? Unless you're incentivized to really take a step back and say, okay, time out. How do I take this idea or this concept back to the bigger team, and that bigger team have the accountability to move fast, right? So we see it all the time where the reason the sales teams don't want to take it back to the IT is because it just dies, right? Or it goes really slow. The reason the IT teams don't like to push anything out to the sales teams is because the sales teams never get it. And it's just kind of this funny balance. So when you talk about an IT strategy, I would argue, and Eric, this is probably where you and your team come in, it's a combination of an IT data and really user strategy. And you got to have champions in every bucket, because we've literally talked with people who are like, don't tell our IT we're doing this, or I would argue the first thing that we do, we don't have sales decks. We sit down with people and say, okay, tell us all the tools you're currently using and what do each of those tools solve. And they'll, kind of go through it, and they're like, this is a weird way to start a sales call. And I'm like, exactly. We don't want to do what you already have done. If we earn the right to have an opportunity to, to earn that piece of the business down the road, that's fine. But, if you already have somebody that's serving as your, your PIM or your DAM or, whatever, basically our job is to make Stopwatch available so that can plug in and you guys can see it all together. It's not to go over and take over that piece and squeeze somebody out.
Yeah, that's really good point. And it as you're talking there, as you guys were answering that question or comment, it occurred to me that such a big part of this whole transformation is really the organizational, not just the change management, which I always talk about that on this show and other thought leadership we put out, but it's also about the organizational design more specifically. Like, how are you going to design the organization? What are people's roles and responsibilities? How are you going to comp them? I mean, if you're trying to, the tool, like the Stopwatch tool, provides some great automation and information, and it fills those gaps that ERP doesn't do. But if you just put in the technology and people are still doing things the way they always have, it doesn't matter. You have to change like you said, the user strategy, the organizational design, roles and responsibilities. You have to design all that stuff thoughtfully so that you can really get value out of a system like this.
Well, that's kind of where, not to sound self-righteous, that's not the intention at all, but that's where I think too, we started building Stopwatch. James had this vision for modularization 4 years ago. That was not cheap to build it that way. We basically took a lot of really weird bets a long time ago that give us flexibility today. And what I think is important is, when people are talking about, solving tools, is that I don't think, people that don't sell the way we do are necessarily malicious. I think it's in their best interest to sell the tool as their tool is built, right? Which really leads to a lot of duplicity potentially of tools. Whereas when you have a very modularized cloud-based system and you come in and you're not threatened by the fact that we have to implement it this way or else we're not going to make any money, is a really different approach. And again, I think we had some foresight, we had some vision, and we got really lucky in terms of the bets that we took early on to do that. And so now we kind of as digital transformation is becoming more popular, we challenge our peers to do right by the company and ask those questions before, instead of just ramrodding in, because I feel like it's part of our responsibility to help them make good decisions, regardless of whether or not it's to buy 2 extra licenses from Stopwatch versus 2 extra licenses from Tableau or something. That doesn't matter to me. They just need to get it right.
Right. So I guess along those lines, you just triggered a question going back to one of the early comments you made, Meagan, about the 4 things that Stopwatch does. The fourth one, you mentioned that it helps you understand what you have, it makes you smarter, it helps you define what to do, and then it does it for me. Could you maybe walk through, I think using Stopwatch as a use case of how technology other than just a core ERP system can automate some things. Maybe could you walk us through that? Like, what do you mean by those four things, or how does a technology like Stopwatch help do that?
Yeah, so James and team really live, I mean, they live in the whole thing, but the do it for me does not exist without show me what I have, make me smarter, tell me what to do. So that's where literally like 90% of the value comes. What's interesting, and I don't know if this is just unique to consumer packaged goods, but there are things regarding how you interact with Amazon, how you interact with Walmart from a back end perspective that are very manual, right? Amazon has a portal that you as a human log into, and you type things in to tell Amazon, what's going on. Independent of EDI, like there's just a lot of kind of computerized mechanization that humans are ultimately doing. And, in any sort of automation kind of system, and this is where the machine learning comes in, once we see, the organization doing, process X over 10 times, that's a couple of SQL queries and, some connector points and pushing things up through an API. So it sounds very like mysterious, like do it for me, but really all it is watching organizations do the same thing with the same partner over and over again. And what we say is we're not going to solve every do it for me, right? Like if you need to, load, the complex, hazmat regulations of shipping motor oil, to Alaska, like that's not something we're going to do for you. Like that is very specialized. But if your product title falls off because a competitor grabbed one of your keywords and you need to put it back up, like that's pretty easy. And that happens a lot of times. And so our goal is really to kind of commoditize a lot of that real easy stuff because you can unleash kind of unsupervised learning in that way. So that the people who do have the knowledge, can kind of watch those reports, make sure that it's all going right, but then they can spend their time and mental energy towards the exceptions where oftentimes the growth happens, right? Like you're not going to gain growth by like continuing to make sure all your titles are right, but you're definitely going to lose if all your titles aren't right, right? So how do you plug that, get the titles right so that then you can focus on growth?
Right. Yeah. Yeah, makes total sense. So I don't know if you'll know the answer to this, so you guys can always pass on this because it wasn't something I told you I would ask you. But
James will know.
A question that popped into my mind though is so you spend, or the product itself helps people do their job to some degree, and it creates a certain amount of efficiency gain and productivity gain and all that good stuff, which means that it frees up some amount of time. I don't know how significant that is, but whatever that amount of time is that it frees up, do you know, or have you seen any examples of how people then end up using that time in either in a more strategic way, or they end up kind of redirecting their attention to something more important, or, have you seen that sort of on the flip side once they've adopted the technology? Because I think it gets back to that organizational design piece and what our user strategy is to make full use of this technology.
Yeah, I know we've had, so from a straight up like one-to-one, we've had teams say that we've let go of agencies where we had 15 people, working for us to deliver, this piece. And now we just have one person overseeing Stopwatch for a fraction of the cost. So that's kind of like a straight economics trade-off. Right. We've seen, and James, I'll let you kind of talk to this too. We've seen, some everyday product managers or everyday business analysts be able to move the needle for their businesses by up to 30% just by looking at by store allocation, right?
how many units are moving through this particular store? Should we be shipping more to this store because it's always out of stock? Oh my gosh, if we just had, this particular store in stock one more day a week, I double my business. I mean, there's just those pockets of insights and granularity that once they have the chance to really dig in and see these kind of movements, they become heroes. And it's things that they would naturally go for if they had the time and energy and visibility to do it. And so I think that's what's been really exciting to see, is that these kind of everyday heroes rise up with these, amazing insights that then they go act upon. And it really does impact the business because they're able to hit the granular pieces that nobody's uncovered. I don't know, James, what have you seen? Because you're kind of in there too.
Yeah, no, I think you're definitely spot on. And kind of from that, I think you also have the continual growth. Like most of the time, as we're talking to teams, teams that are talking about and looking for data solutions and things like that, they've had that should I buy, borrow, build, like that. People have those conversations. And oftentimes they're like, okay, we're going to build it in-house. So what does that look like? We're going to hire 3 analysts and we're going to do this. And it takes a team of analysts. And quite frankly, what that team of analysts is going to end up doing is work on pulling data and getting it normalized and getting it to where they can begin to use a fraction of their time to actually analyze and try to make the business better. Where we've seen kind of from that and that shift of time is now your business analysts, they're not like we didn't necessarily change, all of them, but from a timing perspective, they're now able to take their time from, okay, well, I've downloaded these reports, I've gotten all this, and here's your sales report. That's what they did, that's what they did on their Monday, to, well, now when your analyst gets in on Monday as well, they have all of that stuff already completed, and they can actually start to look at the deeper insights from your business and do the things that more than likely, like, we don't claim to be better than an internal analyst. Like, of course, like if I had access to the very inner deep workings of some of our members and could get every little nuance detail and have that, you're going to be able to make better decisions specifically to the organization you're in. So having an analyst is important, but having your analysts truly be able to focus on impactful decisions, to Meagan's point of being able to find that store level. Well, they can't do that level of detail if they had to spend the majority of their time just trying to get the store sales into, for the week into a report. That's where their time goes versus actually looking at the numbers and the data itself. All important and nothing to them, but because that's just really is the spot that we're at. Holistically.
We call it revenge of the nerds. Like, we know that there's hundreds of $60,000, analysts all over the country who are really smart people, but actually probably haven't come up with a really unique, cadence of problem solving because they're conditioned to just get it together for a quarterly review, and they spend 5 weeks on one big deck that has these really big trendy things, and we're like, what if they could actually just walk in the morning and just start gamifying their business and come into those quarterly reviews look like, hey, I grew your business 50%, and that's a very different kind of conversation, and those are where we want those analysts to be.
Right. Yeah, it's super interesting. I mean, because I could see a tool like Stopwatch, and there's other products out there that might have similar pros and cons, but I could see it being so powerful that it could be over my head as a user, and if I'm not taught how to use it and taught how to make meaning of it and make sense of what it's doing, like what's actually happening and how you can use that data, it's almost so futuristic that I think a lot of people have trouble relating to it or understanding how they could really use that to do their job differently. And it's really about rethinking their job and what their purpose is, and gets into a whole bunch of other stuff, outside of technology.
Yeah, it's interesting that you say that, Eric. We've actually seen this a couple of times, and I liken it to when my husband and I were fostering kiddos. These kids would be really hungry, and then they'd come into our house and they'd steal food from us in our house, and hide it. Because they were so used to being hungry, right? And even though they had the access, open fridge, you can go get it whenever, they still behaved in a way as if, they were deprived. And I liken that a lot to people who first start using Stopwatch. And we have to do a lot of work around helping them feel like, like with this new space that they have, that they actually can spread their wings a little bit. And so it is, one of our challenges, and James works with our membership team. We always joke, we're not consultants by any means. We are a SaaS company, but we do meet with every membership group every single week, mostly because we just want to make sure that they're getting what they need out of the software, and we're encouraging them as they're kind of, starting this new journey. Those are the really fun calls, just to see their momentum over time. The first 3 weeks or so, like, it's kind of like, come on, guys, like, you got to come up with something better than this, and we'll kind of bring up some stuff or ask some questions or whatever, and then all of a sudden it breaks through, and they're just, flying.
Yeah, there's definitely that limit there, where you see them come in, and then all of a sudden they realize,
I can't believe it.
all of these problems are on the table to be solved. Because that's one of the things we get a lot. Like, what problems do you solve? Well, it's like, problems that require multiple data sources, timelines, sources, platforms, and data at scale. Like, it's one of those. It's the business. The business case. It's like, do you have a profitability problem? Do you have a stock problem? Do you have every problem, in that sense is fairly unique to that particular organization. And especially once you take it to the level that we do, because the problem is, we can give you a solution to, so like that particular problem, using Meagan's example of like, the store that has the highest sell-through runs out of stock, yet you keep these same 8 on the shelf for this other store the entire time, and it never moves. So let's get that inventory to this, that. Those particular things are the problems that we can solve to actually make the impact, outside of the big picture problem of being able to kind of manage and handle and do handle that data at scale. So
yeah, absolutely. Well, that's good stuff. Well, I appreciate that. That's probably a good place to leave it. And I have to share this one comment from Luciano on LinkedIn. It's not a question or anything you guys really need to dig into, but I just thought it was funny. It kind of relates to the human side of what we're talking about. But Luciano on LinkedIn said, I talk to my kids, but they don't talk to me. I use my wife as the middleware and integration platform. So as we were talking about data integration, that was his takeaway, is that he can take some of these lessons and apply it in his home life. So that's good. I'm glad we at least help Luciano in some way. So I think some of us can relate to that.
James is my middleware to our development team. I can say something and they just look at me like I'm crazy, and then James turns around and it all happens, and I'm like, what did you say? And like, clearly better.
Use your API conduit there.
Yeah.
Good deal. All right. Well, thanks a lot, guys, for joining today. This was a really interesting conversation. And one last question, how can people learn more about Stopwatch? What website, what's your website, all that good stuff?
Yeah, so you can go on https stopwatch.tech is our direct site. You can find us on LinkedIn at Stopwatch. I'll be honest, we don't have a sales team. Everything's inbound. We've grown the business to date on recommendations and shares. And so, if we're, even if you just want to talk nerdy, that's fine. If we're not the solution for you, we will tell you, just because we really have a passion to make sure you get it right. And if we can help you get it right, we'll help you get it right. And if it's not us, we will help you find the people to get it right. So
good deal. That sounds good. Well, thanks a lot for being here. Really appreciate it. And thank you everyone for joining that joined us here live. And just so you know, or just as a reminder, we do these live streams every Friday, 2 p.m. U.S. Eastern time. You can also look for this interview. We're going to repurpose it for our Transformation Ground Control podcast, which comes out every Wednesday. So this segment will appear in the segment that comes out, or the episode that comes out a week from Wednesday. So be sure to check that out. If you like this topic and want to dive into other stuff, we'll make it part of a broader podcast episode. So thank you for everyone who joined here live today. And thank you again for joining. Have a great weekend, everyone. And we will hope to see you again soon. Thanks a lot, guys.
Yeah, thanks for having us, Eric.
You bet. Thanks for being here. All right, we'll talk soon. Bye.
Bye.